All right, for the last part of the period today, we're going to take a look at ancient Near Eastern religions as a broad general background to these things to help us kind of understand how ancient Near Eastern religions differed from monotheistic Judaism and Christianity, and how they, you know, the way they conceptualize the world is sometimes different. All right. First of all, we got to understand that Israelite religion is the weird religion. It is not like the other religions, so it's unusual or unique. We've talked about polytheism, right? Many gods. We've talked about paganism as a term we often use for that, the worship of many gods. Now, in all ancient Near Eastern societies except Israel and maybe the Zoroastrians believed that there were many gods, and each god ruled over a different aspect of life, a different aspect of nature, a different part of society. And so if you were a farmer, you'd worship the god who brought fertility to the crops. If you were a hunter, you'd worship the god or goddess of the hunt, and so on. You worship the god whose activity or whose domain controls the activities you're engaged in. And if you go to sea, you worship the god of the sea, and so forth. All right? So it's not that, you know, there was one true God and other false gods. There were lots of gods, and they all had different powers and different relationships, and you worshiped them all in different settings and for different purposes and circumstances. Often you would have a specific god associated with your city or your tribe. That was kind of your special god, too. Now, these gods had families and children, so they talk about them in family relationships. And this is probably most known to you from the Greek mythology, where Zeus has children, and and sometimes the gods can have children with humans. And so you have what are called demigods or half-gods. These guys are half god, half human. Hercules is an example. Gilgamesh, the hero of the Gilgamesh epic, a Mesopotamian figure we'll talk about a little later, he's a demigod. He's actually said to be 2/3 God and 1/3 human. And I'm not quite sure how that worked, but that's what they say. Now, another characteristic of ancient Near Eastern religions is the worship of images. Now, we call this idolatry sometimes, or image worship, but basically the belief was that you set up an image of the god, and that image it can be infused with the power of the god, that the god's presence will reside there in some way. Now, the Israelites, of course, were explicitly said you can't worship images. On the other hand, they seem to have done it a lot anyway. And so, there's problematic issues in relationship with Israel in that regard. But the setting up of an image in a holy place to represent the presence of God was a very, very common thing to do. I mean, everybody did it. And when you generally in the most sacred part of the temple, you'd set up the God's image, and then you'd pray to it, you'd sing hymns to it, you'd offer food to it, and you would clothe it, and you would anoint it and wash it, you'd do all sorts of stuff to it. And if you go down to the Hare Krishna temple down there on the right days, you'll see them offering food to their images that they have in the temple there. It's the same thing that was going on in the ancient Near East. Now, you tended to want to worship the God that could help you most in this world. Generally speaking, gods were there to help you in this world. That was their purpose. You worship them to get their support and help. And the main thing you wanted was fertility. We need to understand that in our modern age, we have a superabundance of food. We are the only age in history in our, one of the few countries in the world today where being overweight is a greater health problem than starving to death. By far in antiquity, people would starve to death regularly. This would be a normal occurrence. Okay? So the main thing you want is fertility, which means you want your crops to grow and you want your animals to reproduce so that you can have food for next year. That was the main thing you wanted from the gods. And that was generally came through rain. The rains came and they brought, the crops to grow, they brought water for your animals, and you could survive the next year. So that was a key thing. But also fertility of your family was important. Because, you have a wife, you have a husband, whatever it is, you want to have children. Why do you want to have children? Because Obama is not there to take care of you when you get old or when you get sick. The only way you're going to survive when you get old and sick is if you have children who will take care of you. You raise them up and then they take care of you when you're old and sick. You don't survive without children. They are crucial to your, at some point you will starve to death if you don't have children to take care of you. Okay? So that was very important as well. Now, often the ancient peoples would worship a major god. That is, there were lots of gods, but they picked a particular god that was their city god. They called it a patron god. Most famous example of this is the city of Athens. Patron goddess is Athena. Okay? Now, Baal was the patron god of the Canaanites. But Baal is an interesting name because it really just means Lord. Right? It doesn't mean, it's not the personal name of a king. His name was actually probably Hadad. But they call him Baal, which means Lord. Just like we often talk about the Lord, although that is based on Hebrew Adonai, a different name for Lord. Anyway, Baal is probably more like master than Lord. But at any rate, that's the idea there. Another characteristic of ancient Near Eastern religions was that they often equated the gods of different societies. What happens if you're a Canaanite, you meet an Egyptian, and the Egyptians say, well, we worship Amun-Re, and they say, well, we worship Baal. And the Canaanites say that. So what happens? Do you say, well, Amun-Re doesn't exist, or Amun-Re is an evil god? Well, sometimes they do that, actually. They have conflicts among the gods and theological debates. But more frequently, the response of the polytheists was either that, yes, your gods exist too, so we worship Baal and you worship Amun-Re, and they both exist. They're both gods. Amun-Re has power in Egypt, Baal has power in Syria. The other response was to say, well, yeah, you worship Amun-Re, but he's the same God as Baal. They're just really the same God. Okay? We just call them different names. So like we call a horse and you call it something else. We call God Baal, you call him Amun-Re. It's the same God. And you can see this among the Greeks and the Romans, where the Roman god is Jupiter, the Greek god is Zeus, and what do they say? It's the same God. In reality, they're not. They're quite different if you go back and look at their origins and stuff. But by the time the Romans conquered the Greeks, Jupiter and Zeus are the same, as are Baal, he's the same as Zeus and Jupiter, as is Amun-Re, as is Marduk of Babylon, as is Yahweh, the Lord of Israel. The Romans said, yeah, the Jews are very weird. They only worship Zeus. That's how they describe the Jews. They won't worship any other god. And they won't set up a statue of Zeus in their temple. When the Romans and Greeks describe the Jews, that's how they do. So syncretism is where all the gods exist. You can worship other gods of other nations, but each god is probably just a different name for the same type of god. They would do it, they would understand it different ways, but that's generally how they would interact with one another. Somebody had a hand up? Yes?
They still do this today. I served on a mission with a lot of people.
Uh-huh.
And they would tell me who Christ was.
Yeah.
And Mary was. They try and compare everything they do.
Yes. Hindus are very syncretistic, exactly. I mean, they're probably the most syncretistic group around. So they will tell you probably that Christ is an avatar of Vishnu or something like that, right? And in fact, they did it with the Buddhists as well. The Hindus absorbed Buddhism by saying Buddha is an avatar of Vishnu, who is one of the supreme gods who manifests himself in human form. So if you talk to a Hindu and you tell them the Joseph Smith story, they'll say, yeah, I believe it, sure, absolutely, I believe that happened. Why not? But they'll just say, so what? I mean, God manifests himself all over the place, all the time, lots of different ways. And it's really just, all Atman or Brahman or something. Okay? So, that's the same type of thing that's going on in polytheistic syncretism. Very common. Yes? Hand up?
I was raised in an Irish branch of the Roman Catholic Church, and when I was being raised, I was told the story of how all the gods were conquered by one God who became the God that we worship as Christians.
Right.
So, I mean, that's still alive also in a lot of branches of Catholicism.
Yep. I went to Ireland last May, and I went to a place called, it was the Church of Bridget, and they had a shrine of Bridget there. And Bridget is a Catholic saint, a female saint, but she was also a polytheistic Irish goddess. And in fact, this is simply turning a Irish goddess into a Catholic saint, and you've got this transition here. Although the Catholics today would say, no, it's nothing to do with that. It's, they've separated them, but that's probably how it originally got going. Anyway, so yes, it's not uncommon. Now, what was their religion like? Now, the Canaanites, we've talked about these guys before, we're still kind of on them. Canaanites spoke a Semitic language, very close to Hebrew. We've explained that, right? There were lots of tribes of the Canaanites, including all these different groups, and the Jebusites were the particular Canaanite tribe that lived in Jerusalem, right? They spoke a language that's very, very similar to the Israelites, and they are archaeologically very difficult to distinguish between the two. That is to say, if you go to dig up Provo 1,000 years from now, and you've got a Baptist guy in one house and a Mormon guy in another house, they live side by side. You go into their houses, and from the archaeological record, could you tell a Baptist from a Canaanite, or from a Mormon? Based on archaeology. Is their car different? Are their clothes different? There may be a couple of things, a little markers that you could tell, but for the most part, they all have TVs, they all have dishwashers, they all have cars, they all have, they wear the same type of shoes. They just seem the same. Now, culturally, there may be a big difference between the two in reality, but archaeologically, those cultural differences do not necessarily manifest themselves. So bear that in mind as you think about how these things work. We've already talked about that idea. The cities here have a number of different gods associated with them. Byblos was Baal, Sidon was Astarte, Tyre was Melkart, and so forth. These are Canaanite gods. So notice, each city has its own patron god. Now, Jerusalem also had its patron god, who is Yahweh, which is the Hebrew for Jehovah, which is usually translated the Lord in the King James Version. Okay? So, if you're an Israelite, is Yahweh your patron god, one god among many, or is Yahweh the one true God and the other gods aren't real? Which is it? Well, the Israelites actually debated this quite a bit, right? Because a lot of the Israelites worship Baal too, right? And when they did, remember the story of Elijah and Baal and the Lord, and the Lord is Yahweh here in this story. And Elijah says to them, okay, you got to decide. If Yahweh is God, worship Him. If Baal is God, worship Him. You got to decide between the two. That's not what the priests of Baal were saying. They were saying Baal and Yahweh are two different names for the same God. So there was a completely different approach to this. Elijah was saying, no, they're completely different. And the other guys were saying, no, they're the same. So we worship Baal and we worship Yahweh, and they're both the same. So it made it a very complicated problem for these Israelites to try to figure this out. This is a place at Byblos where they're using standing stones to represent the gods. Now notice, this is very much like the Gezer thing where you had an alignment of standing stones. But it's starting to change. Number one is, you're creating a high place or a raised altar on which you have this giant central stone. This would represent the head god. Notice these stones are now being carved and shaped like Egyptian obelisks. Okay, so they're saying we don't want a rough stone. That's too crappy. God's got to have a cool, smooth stone. And they're sometimes in different shapes, and they're lined up in different ways. So this is a big temple at Byblos. This is an old Canaanite temple. And notice, they don't have images carved on these. They have just plain stone. And that was what the Israelites were talking about too. No graven images. So it wasn't exclusively an Israelite characteristic. That's the ones at Gezer. We talked about them before, right? So you can see that what's going on here is just a more developed, systematized, elaborate view of this with a temple built, these stones in a temple now, as opposed to just freestanding out in a plaza somewhere. Now, they also have some images like these which are cast bronze with a gold foil put on them, so that you would offer little images to the gods sometimes. They found lots of these, hundreds of these in these temples where a guy would buy one and offer it to the god.